Hey guys, Brian Schultz here with the Actually Tiny House, and I just finished framing this long rake wall here that's going to make the north wall of the trailer and is going to slope from the back of the trailer to the front of the trailer. Now, I have over 20 years of building experience, and this actually stumped me a little bit. So I figured if I had a little bit of difficulty figuring out how to do this, other people might as well. So I figured I'd fire up the camera here for a few minutes and give you a few tips. Looking at the trailer here, the first thing you notice is that there isn't actually enough physical room in the bed of the trailer for the wall to fit down inside of to frame it. So that's the first obstacle that we have to overcome. Now, the strategy that I took for this was actually to take the 2x6s, which are going to be the rafters for my roof running longitudinally, and set them right on top of my floor frame like this and secure them with some blocks, which is screwed into the floor frame. And that allows me to get the entire frame up off the bottom of the trailer. Now, the next thing I had to figure out was how to locate points to make this square, because unlike a normal wall where you would just build it however and then square it up at the end, if you're doing a cut in place rake wall like this, you have to actually build it square from the beginning, so when you scribe your line across the top of the rake wall, it's actually accurate. So what I figured out I could do here was I could take a combination square like this, slide it along the top of this repurposed rafter right here until I get right to the edge of the trailer flange there. And then that gives me a point projected straight up from the trailer flange that I can mark on top of this 2x6 right here. And I can do that at all four corners. And assuming the trailer was made square, that gives me 4 marks that I can be almost certain are square, and I can actually check it diagonal to diagonal and make sure it's actually square before I start building. So now that I've got a flat surface that's up high that I can work on without bumping into the wheel wells, and I've got marks on there to keep everything nice and square, the next step is I'm going to make myself some story poles that are going to have all of the locations for all the various vertical framing members in the walls. Now, if this were a normal wall, you would just lay out your bottom plate, lay out your top plate identical, cut your studs to length, sandwich the two together, and then nail it off. But because this is a rake wall that has both a gap in the bottom plate to get around the wheel well, and also because it's really difficult to figure out the spacing on the angled top plate for your vertical members without doing a bunch of math or without doing some computer drafting, it can be a little tricky to figure out how you're going to set this whole thing up. But fortunately, there's a really easy way to do that, and that's just to go ahead and lay out some sacrificial 2x lumber as though you were laying out for a square wall, and then use that as story poles to align the vertical members before you nail on your bottom plates, and also before you scribe the angle for your rake to go ahead and cut for your rake wall. So come on over and check out my actual story poles here. Now, this is, like I just said, laid out exactly like you would lay out a normal square wall. I've got my spacing for all of my different framing members in the wall. The only thing that's really different in this is I've added some blocks to the bottom here. So this wall here is already framed up, but if you imagine that it hasn't been framed yet, what we did is we took our studs and we spaced them randomly across the entire top of the trailer here, and then we took our story pole and set it on top of that and flushed up the end wall stud with the block right here, and then made sure that that was sitting right on top of the mark that we projected up off the trailer right here, clamped all that together so nothing could move. That gives us one fixed point where everything is lined up nice and square in the corner. Went ahead and did that at the other end, and then I took the other story pole and moved it 7 feet up from this on the wall, so it's parallel with this story pole, and then I was able to move the studs so they lined up with the marks on both story poles, and then I could take my pre-cut bottom plates and nail them on, get my header set up over the wheel well, nail on the other bottom plate, and now I'm almost ready to head up to the top and start marking and cutting for that rake at the top. But before I do that, there's one very, very, very important thing that needs to happen. I need to take a string line and pull straight across the bottom of my wall here to make sure that this is dead straight, because if it isn't and you cut the top of your rake wall, you're going to end up with a wall that's going to be wonky and it's not going to be able to bolt onto the trailer. Now, coming up to this story pole at the top of the wall here, the first thing I'm going to do is just double check my measurement to make sure it's exactly the same height from the bottom plate on both ends of the wall. And then I'm going to take a screw gun and I'm going to physically screw the story pole to the studs at each location so it holds everything nice and tight so nothing moves while we're actually marking out for our rake. So the height of the lower end of your rake wall is going to be equal to the height of the end wall that you've already framed up for this, or the end wall that you're gonna frame up for this. So all you've got to do is come up along the stud that's sticking out until you get to the top of where you want that top plate to be. You're going to take a string line, clamp it on right there, and then you're going to stretch this string line back across the tops of all of these studs until you get to the other end. So heading up to the tall end of the rake wall here with my string line, it's tempting for me to locate this point at the height of the end wall that I framed up for this, or the end wall that I'm gonna frame up for this end. And that makes sense intuitively, but it's actually a mistake, and I'll show you why. So what's going to happen if you try to frame it up this way with the height of the end wall flush with the top of the rake wall is that it looks good right now, but look what happens when we put our roof rafter on here later. You can see that we have good bearing surface along the top plate, but we have no bearing surface along the top of the end wall here. So the actual correct arrangement here is to have your end wall be a little bit taller than the end of your rake wall. So when your rafter goes into place like this, it gets notched out and you've got good bearing surface on the end wall and on the top plate. So how you're going to set this up is you'll get yourself just a little stick of lumber here and you'll slide this along the stud until it is at the height that your end wall is going to be. And then you're going to pull your string to this corner right here, and you're going to come back along your string, and wherever this crosses the stud that's sticking out right here is going to be the height of the top plate on your rake wall, and then by extension 1.5 inches down from here is going to be the top of this actual stud. And now that we've got the location for the top of the top plate at the low end of the rake wall and the top of the top plate at the high end of the rake wall, all we've got to do is measure 1.5 inches down from that, make a mark, and then take this string and stretch it super tight from mark to mark, and then go along on each stud and mark off all of those angles. And once you've done that, you just have to get your speed square, carry that mark down either side, and then you're going to get your skill saw and set that to whatever the angle of this rake is going to be. In this case, it happened to be 6 degrees. And then you can just walk down the line here and very carefully, because it's a little bit of an awkward cut, go ahead and cut the tops of these off. And once you're done with that, now all you've got to do is go ahead and cut your top plate to length, go walk down the line, nail everything off, and you've got a perfectly square, nice, clean rake wall framed out. This isn't exactly rocket science, but there were enough things that could trip you up that I felt like it was worth making a video. Now, interestingly enough, you don't actually have to go through this whole procedure again to frame the opposite wall. Because you've got a known set of parameters here, now all you've got to do is just walk around and take measurements off of this wall. You can pre-cut all of your pieces for the next wall, and you can just assemble it in place right on top of this wall, which is super convenient. Now, as always, if you have any suggestions for how to do this better or faster or easier, please leave them in the comments section. If you learned something from this video, think about hitting that subscribe button. And finally, be safe working on your tiny house. All right, that's it for now. I'll see you next time.